If we think of what we have over here, unmissable digital leaders, interesting topic. A lot of names come to mind. It's very easy to figure out unmissable digital leaders when they are multi-billion-dollar valued companies. It's extremely difficult to figure out the next big digital leader when it's actually starting. So actually, the fun of spotting digital leaders is that most digital leaders, when they start, are highly missable. Almost none of them are unmissable. And even if we think of the unmissable digital leaders of today, we end up with the usual suspects, the motley crew of Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, perhaps Twitter, perhaps Airbnb. I was told Uber is not very well known, but it's also probably one of those big digital leaders out there. If we look at all of these companies, what we note about them is that a lot of them sounded ludicrous when they first started. Twitter was this strange website which just had a text box to write 140 characters and nobody knew what to do with it. A lot of people still don't know what to do with it. Airbnb was this hipster community that shared mattresses with each other. Nobody thought Marriott would worry about it one day and Sheraton would have a problem with it. And Google was this really strange website that used to send people away from it at a time when websites were valued on the basis of the number of page views they had. So everybody else was laughing their way to the bank saying, we're not Google, we're not Google. And most of them are not there today. Google is still around. So what we see across all of this is that the next unmissable digital leader always tends to follow the anti-pattern. It's actually extremely difficult to spot the next big digital leader. Many venture capitalists actually feel that the next big digital leader does not exist. That's why they call them unicorns. In Silicon Valley, there's this term called unicorns for the next big thing. And if you look at the history of technology predictions, probably trying to drive home a point, but if you look at the history of technology predictions, it's been peppered with wildly miscalculated predictions of what the next big thing is going to be. We have people who spend a lot of time at IBM, and probably the most famous person ever associated with IBM did this market sizing mistake that ended up costing them quite a bit. The father of disruptive innovation himself felt that what you and I carry every day in our pockets was not disruptive enough, the iPhone. And repeatedly, we've been in this habit of spouting the next headline as X is the new Y, and what happens is Y is a multi-billion-dollar company, and X very often ends up being a dud, which is something that happened with the companies over here. So repeatedly, we've been in this place where spotting the next big thing has been really difficult. So I've got 10 minutes right now. I don't have any snake oil which can help us spot the next big digital thing. What I do feel that even though we cannot spot the next big digital thing very easily, we can hopefully use these 10 minutes to create a lens through which we can better look for one. None of us is going to come out of this at the end of it and say, hey, I've got an investment today that's going to make me a billionaire 2 years down the line. But at least let's try to figure out the properties that are unique to the internet that make internet businesses so powerfully scalable in a way that non-network businesses could never have scaled. And again, before I get to that, I want to make this point that when I say digital, I still mean network. To me, a truck connected to the internet is a lot more digital than a computer that is not connected. A computer that is cannot create value in the same way that a truck that is connected to the internet. So to create this lens, let's take a step back, and I want to talk about two ways in which I think about the world. It's something that we see around us every day, but I just want to put a structure to it. The first model of business is what I think of as pipe thinking. It's the kind of business that we've been essentially very familiar with because this is what the Industrial Revolution gave us. The businesses that we've grown familiar with is what I think of as a pipe. Value is created upstream in this business, value moves downstream, and there's a consumer sitting at the other end of the pipe with his mouth open and taking all of that value in, whether it applies to him or not. He's just convinced through marketing campaigns and the like that it has to apply to him, and he has that need to buy the next car, even though he has a car. So what happens with this pipe is, if you think of supply chains, they work in this model. They keep shifting things down the pipe, and there's a consumer at the end taking all of it in. Radios, television, traditional media works in this straight line model. Value is repeatedly created at one end and pushed out and sent to the other end. And the way you scale such a business is you build out the pipe, and then you gradually reduce the cost of moving value through the pipe. And The problem is that when the internet first happened, we saw it as a really efficient pipe. And we saw it as the same thing, we just saw it as way better than everything else we'd seen so far. We saw it as a pipe with zero marginal costs, so you could create something, and then you could spew it out to the whole world without worrying about where you had a distribution network and where you did not. So we still thought of it as a pipe, just a very efficient pipe, and that's why one of the first industries that got disrupted because of the internet was the newspaper industry. Because the newspaper industry was trying to break its head figuring out how to cut down distribution costs, and the internet came in and said, hey, zero distribution costs, you're out. So that was the way we first thought of the internet. The first few disruptions, if you think of Amazon or Netflix beating Barnes & Noble and Blockbuster, in all of these cases, we saw a very efficient pipe with zero marginal costs coming in and disrupting something that had really high marginal costs of distribution. But I believe that if we look at the internet as just an extremely efficient pipe, we're missing out on the most important property of scale that the internet brings. And that's what I like to call platform thinking, which is fundamentally different from pipe thinking. And when we think of the word platform, one of the first things that comes to mind is what we carry on ourselves every day. 10 years back, if you had a phone, you wouldn't think of the word platform associated with the phone. You'd just call it a handset or something. But we increasingly hear of the words Android platform, Apple platform associated with the phone. Let's look at what the design of this business looks like. If you think of how Apple or Android look, they don't look like a pipe anymore. These businesses look fundamentally different. Apple or Android opens up a platform on which external developers can create apps and put that on the App Store, and we can go and purchase apps as consumers and extend the phone into any wildly imaginable thing possible. So the design of the business fundamentally changes. The business itself no longer creates the end value. It provides an infrastructure on which others can build. It captures data about what is being built and data about what users want, and it tries to match the right things that are being built on top of it with the right users, and tries to govern these interactions that happen on top of the business. But this is not unique to Apple or the iPhone. If we think of a lot of other things that are happening today, Airbnb works in a similar model. It allows hosts to create rooms on top of it and run hotels. YouTube works in a similar model. You don't need to be in Hollywood to be the next big media company. You can just exist on YouTube and have millions of viewers. And Amazon re-intermediated an entire industry which used to work like a pipe, removed the non-scalable human expert editorial process and substituted it with a social editorial review-based process, if you will, and acted like a platform. So repeatedly, what we see across these businesses is that the business acts as an infrastructure, allowing for external parties to add value on top of it. It then creates a market, which may or may not already exist. If a market already exists, it re-intermediates that market. And it specifies the conditions that govern what kinds of interactions are allowed. So if you allow all kinds of videos on YouTube, YouTube needs to tell you, needs to have a way by which you as a consumer can know what is a good video and what is not. Because if you cannot figure that out, there's a market failure. You're spending too much time figuring out what applies to you, and there's a market failure. So what a lot of these platforms do is just create this infrastructure and govern the market that starts sprouting on top of it. And I believe that the next unmissable digital leaders are all going to be platforms. In fact, most unmissable digital leaders today are already platforms. If we look at all the companies, most of the companies that have gained multi-billion-dollar valuations from zero in the last 5 years are actually platforms. We think of the Airbnbs and Ubers of the world, or the Spotifys of the world, all of which did not exist around 10 years back, all of which are multi-billion-dollar valuations, and all of which are actually platforms. And there's something very specific about platforms that makes them so scalable. And there are 3 reasons why platform scale is fundamentally different from pipe scale. Because if you had to scale pipes, you had to grow a business, and you had to keep hiring employees, putting in more capital, expanding the business overseas, and that was the way you would scale. The 3 ways that platforms scale are fundamentally different from the way that pipes scale. To start with, platforms do not necessarily need to scale internally to scale value. They need to scale their ecosystem. So Airbnb does not scale the way Marriott scales. If Marriott has to scale, it has to open more hotels all over the world. If Airbnb has to scale, it has to get more hosts on board, ensure that there's a good amount of overlap between what people are looking for and what's being hosted, and ensure that the trust conditions that prevent market failure are being provided by Airbnb through their rating system, through the insurance system, whatever. So the ecosystem becomes the new workforce. If you want to scale value, you don't scale workforces anymore. That's why we hear of these small, tiny startups, less than 100 employees, multi-billion-dollar valuations, largely in all of these cases because the value is being created by the ecosystem. I'm not defending the valuations, maybe some of them don't make sense, but the point is that you don't need to scale internal processes to scale value. The second reason, which is a lot more important, which was non-existent in the world of pipes, is that when external creators start creating value on top of your business, what happens is something very interesting, which drives your marketing costs to zero over time. These creators, when they create value, they end up pulling in consumers. And when consumers come on board, that attracts even more creators to come on board, which in turn attracts even more consumers to come on board. And so there's this nice virtuous feedback loop that sets up. If you had to scale a pipes market, you would have to invest in more marketing. But if this kind of feedback loop sets up, and if the friction to allowing this feedback loop is minimum, for example, Facebook has minimum friction to this feedback loop. Uber has some friction. You need to start this repeatedly in different cities. But depending on how small the friction is, this feedback loop can really cut down marketing costs. And that's why network effects are the new scaling strategy when it comes to platforms. And the third reason platforms are really scalable is because they don't think like pipes. If Coca-Cola had to scale, it would put out 10 different drinks, 10 different kinds of things to eat, and none of them would talk to each other. It wouldn't matter if you drank Coke and ate chips from some other manufacturer. It really wouldn't matter. But what happens with platforms is, if I get my phone from the same guy who gives me my watch, from the same guy who gives me my car, and potentially he helps me connect my cat to the internet as well, the value that I get out of it is way more than getting individual phone, watch, cat, whatever. Because what platforms do is they use data as a connecting layer to connect all these different products to each other. And using this data, they then offer services that were just not possible. Nest Thermostat is an example of a company that sells hardware to capture data to then offer services to the city utilities board that was just not possible with traditional products. And this is why, because of these three reasons, these three drivers of scale, I believe that platforms are going to be the next unmissable digital leaders. And I want to wrap this up by talking about two specific ways in which platforms will become digital leaders. The first is the Silicon Valley way. The startup in the garage gets funding, goes to Y Combinator, then has this big IPO, which we are very well aware of. The second is the kind of digital leader that we may just end up missing because we may never think of such companies as digital in the first place. So let me talk about the first pattern that I see. The first pattern is platforms eating pipe across industries. And if you think of different industries, telecom got disrupted from a pipe to a platform. Nokia used to decide what apps should be preloaded. Apple was open. Hotels facing disruption from Airbnb potentially, pipes moving to platforms. Amazon reintermediated the traditional publishing industry, removed the unscalable gatekeeper, reinstated itself as a much more scalable gatekeeper, and created a platform. But more importantly, I believe that the same movement from pipes to platforms is going to happen in all information-mediated industries, banking, healthcare, education, all of which are industries that essentially are information-intensive. All of them are going to move to this. They're just not moving today because they're so highly regulated and because the cost of participating in a transaction are so high. But the second wave that, and I want to quickly wrap this up, but the second most important thing that I believe is important is pipes that will start thinking like platforms. And this is very interesting because we might see 100-year-old traditional companies, mining companies, oil and gas companies, logistics companies becoming the next big digital leaders. And they do that because they start thinking like platforms. The first company to really think like platforms in a big way was Apple, when it connected a traditional hardware company, connected all of its products at the data layer using iTunes and iCloud so that everybody who uses an Apple product tries to own more than one because the value is just so much higher. It's not just a fanboy thing. But we're seeing Nike doing the same thing, where Nike is trying to connect your phone to your shoe, your fuel band to your shoe, your phone to somebody else's phone, and then your shoe to somebody else's shoe, and then it's trying to create communities on top of that. It's not selling shoes anymore. It's helping you exist in an ecosystem of athletics and fitness, if you will. because of a range of physical and digital products and services that all connect with each other at the data layer. And finally, a very industrial company like GE is now thinking about this in terms of a platform where it's connecting all of its machines to the internet so that each machine can then learn from its own mistakes, it can learn from the mistakes of other machines, and over time, it can benefit through greater utilization, greater productivity. So to sum it up, I believe the unmissables will be platforms. I believe that digital is not about creating an app. I believe that the real shift that we are part of today is not about whether you can sell online or offline, whether you're digital or whether you have an app or not. What's important is, are you networked or are you not networked? Are you building an ecosystem around your business or are you not? And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.